So you can hear me nicely?
Loud and clear. Same for me, I hope.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good. Wonderful.
So let me just say a little bit about what this is, how I've ended up doing this, and what's different about talking to you, especially for people who are listening. So this started off with me dragging a friend of mine and a film crew around, getting the chance to speak to some people that I found that interesting folk that I wanted to raise this big question: what is life with, and see how people responded, because I carry that around with me all the time. And then that kind of came to an end because that's quite a big thing to do. And I've continued going, well, I just want to keep having the conversation with people on Zoom. So I've had that. And then this is the first one where you commented on things that you'd seen, and it came up, hey, I think you suggested, why don't we have a conversation? And I looked at what you're up to, looked really, really interesting. You describe yourself as a Whiteheadian, which is particularly interesting to me. So unlike my other things, apart from the stuff that I've read, we're starting off really from ground zero. Because I think, unlike normally, I would like to ask you to say a little bit about yourself, Matt, and how you're in this conversation before we launch into anything.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks, Tim, for accepting my request, and I was just so excited after I found your YouTube channel and watched some of the interviews that you did with people who I also think are doing great work and are really exciting to learn from. But like you, I'm someone who is fascinated by the scientific picture of the universe, but who also has, whether because of luck or karma or who knows what, my own decisions and choices in life, has had these spiritual experiences that make me realize, the scientific picture is only part of the story, and that there's more going on here, and the inner reality of soul life is just as consequential as the outer reality that's been measured and cataloged and analyzed so thoroughly by what we call modern science. So I think I've been a philosopher since I was about 7 years old. If I had to put a date on it, when I realized that not only was I going to die, but it was really when I realized my mother was going to die. It threw me into this whole reflective mood of consciousness that hasn't really left me since then, just meditating on death. And so my philosophical interest started pretty young, and at various phases of my life, I encountered other, I guess, traditions that helped me understand this mood that contemplating death sort of threw me into. And more recently, as a scholar and a professor, I've really gotten into the work of Alfred North Whitehead, who I think I have to credit with teaching me to think in a metaphysical way, where metaphysics is just the strenuous effort to think clearly about the nature of reality. And so, Whitehead has given me a language and a method and shared a vision with me that I think is very compelling. And it's certainly oriented me for like the last decade in my inquiry into these mysteries. But the whole history of Western philosophy has been an important formative influence on me.
That's a great line.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel a sense of responsibility to inherit that tradition, because I feel like it is still vibrant and alive, and can be valuable for our contemporary situation.
So you have to excuse me a second, Matt. I've got some lights on here because it's dark where I am.
Yeah.
It's getting a bit hot. So I'm just so when you have glasses, you steam up when it gets hot, and I want to be able to see you. So
yeah, I'm having the opposite problem. It's cold over here.
Well, it is normally cold over here. It's been cold all day, but now I've got these lights on. If I might have to switch them off, they get they get a bit
Yeah,
warm.
no problem. Make yourself comfortable.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. Settle in. So, and you're a professor where?
At the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. Of course, yes.
In the same program as the cosmologist Brian Swim,
As
who you
Brian.
interviewed a little while ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I really loved that conversation with Brian. So great. Let's let's come in then with my question, and let's see where we go.
Yeah.
You know, you've been looking at this since you were 7. What is it? What do you think this is that we're in, that we're experiencing right now?
It's a process of trying to wake up, I think. Which is to say that, you know, it feels like there's no end to that process.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first, you know, 7 is like an arbitrary age,
Yeah,
but
of course.
I think, you know, when I was like in my late teens, I started really getting into meditation and studying Eastern philosophy and trying to understand what this is in terms of a switch I could flick somewhere inside my mind that would just awaken me. And that enlightenment was just something that was that quick and permanent, and then you were just there, and you finally arrived in a fully awake state of consciousness and could perceive reality for what it is. And then, you know, I think I kind of became a little disillusioned with that understanding of enlightenment, because my life continued to unfold. Like, I thought I had had these experiences, and they kept happening in states of meditation or psychedelic exploration. And I was like, okay, well, I have these experiences of oneness, and I feel like I'm connected to the ultimate nature of reality, and it's so blissful and wonderful. And then I get hungry, or then my mom calls, or then like, oh, it's time to go to work, and the laundry's piling up. And so like life went on, and all the complexity of being human in, you know, a society, and aging, and illness, and all these things, they didn't go away, you know. So it makes me feel now that this is a process, this reality that isn't as simple as just being. It's not just being. There's something
Yeah,
becoming, right?
yeah, yeah.
And it doesn't
Not
quite
just
know what.
being. That's really good. That's a really good. It's not just being.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, this isn't just being. It is being, but it's not just being. It keeps
Mm-hmm.
on changing. It's becoming something. And there is a form of spirituality, which I think is very dominant. So my path has been very similar, obviously a few decades before you, but of that same thing, that kind of, the message I was hearing was, it is about just being. And if you can just be in the right way, and then coming back to, hang on, but I'm in a process of becoming, and not just me, but the whole universe is in a process of becoming. And having to question the message I hear from the traditions, especially the ones that came around at the Axel age and have been with us ever since, that somehow the becoming is a trap from which we need to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And then arriving, you know, one of the reasons I love Brian is he was formative in me listening to the evolutionary story and going, hang on, this seems really meaningful, amazing, beautiful, actually, and gives this human existence meaning over and above being a problem to get away from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that what you're describing? Similar?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's it. I mean, I think, you know, evolution is a pretty earth-shattering paradigm shift that has occurred in only the last couple hundred years, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's
extraordinary.
You know, making sense of that evolutionary picture where we see that this whole universe is this energetic event. It's a process of becoming. we think we can kind of see where it came from, though it sort of recedes into a singularity, and like we just can't see beyond that singularity. The laws of physics break down and all that, and it seems like maybe it's headed somewhere and it's accelerating, and but we don't quite know where it's all heading either. We're just in the middle of it. And I really think of, the discovery of evolutionary, not only biology but cosmology.
Cosmology, yeah.
It's just as difficult for our religious traditions to wrap their heads around as it is for scientific materialism to wrap its head around. It undoes a certain simplistic understanding of like creationism just as much as it undoes a simplistic materialism. So evolution forces us to really shift our sense of what ultimate reality is. And people like you, I feel a kinship with, because I feel like these religious traditions, these wisdom traditions are still meaningful to us, but we realize how there's a very new context that these traditions need to be, I guess, translated into, so that they can serve our new sense of like existential, our new sense of existence in an evolutionary universe.
I think, yeah, I really feel that. I think a big thing for me was, I don't know when this happened for me, but was thinking, I don't want to, even in the word tradition, there's a conservatism about spirituality. It's one of the few areas in life where if you go, oh, it's thousands of years old, people go, oh, that's good. If it was brain surgery, you just wouldn't think that was good. Like, really?
Yeah.
But spirituality, oh, how old? Oh, can it, the older the better. And my feeling is very much that my aspiration, when I look at the people, the people who I admire in the history of spirituality, it's my greatest aspiration would be to do what they did. And what it strikes me is that the people that we still explore their ideas and know their names is because they changed things. They actually marked a juncture where things evolved, and they did it in a fresh way. They reinvented, they took things which were perennially true and they saw them in a new light. And that sense of spirituality is itself evolving, I think, is absolutely key. So it just feels like, look, like just as Einstein was standing on the shoulders of Newton, who himself said he was standing on the shoulders of giants, it's that kind of sense of we're absolutely doing that, but our duty to them is not to just repeat, it's to actually evolve.
Yeah, I think that's right. And from another angle, the whole history of religion and religious experience has been a series of renewals, and there's already been an evolution occurring,
Totally.
an evolution of consciousness, right?
So
luckily, we don't have to be the first to rethink how we relate to the divine.
we're at the end of a very long process in which people have been doing that the whole time. But there is more. I mean, maybe that's not true. Maybe there's, in every area where things become established, there is a weight, a passivity, a kind of weight to the past, which makes it resistant to move on. And that can happen really fast. I mean, one of the things which fascinates me is that I've seen non-dual spirituality in the West. I've seen it arrive from the point where no one I knew the word non-duality or Advaita. No one. To the point where there was someone teaching Advaita on every street corner. And a sense that the kind of neo-Advaitic thing, when it became strong, was that people were just hearing it and going along. It was just the reality. Yourself is self is an illusion. Life has no meaning. It's, you just see through, and then you've got the understanding and you've arrived, for instance. And then suddenly there's a whole thing. It's in the collective, and it needs questioning. It has to be pushed.
Yeah, I think I identify strongly with a certain lineage in that history coming out of the Jewish prophetic tradition, because of the way that it doesn't separate, and there are different traditions that do the same thing, but it doesn't separate spiritual realization from like socio-political justice movements. which is to say that there's a way in which whatever the nature of God is, it's not somehow something you could just escape out of this world into. It's something that would transform this world.
Yeah.
And I worry that some of these, the way that this non-dual spirituality has caught on, it lends itself very easily to it gets called spiritual bypassing, or a sense of escapism, where
there's a kind of I mean, these are massive kind of crazy generalizations, of course. Go closer.
We've only been speaking for 10
they're
minutes.
all so different, but there's a sense in which I think it's one of the things you can see with the Eastern traditions and the kind of the Judeo-Christian traditions tend to be much more willing to endorse the individual. I don't think it's any coincidence that individuality has taken off so strongly in the West, and personally I think that's fantastic. And has been much slower in the East, and yet we've often had to go to the East to find that other side to spirituality, that transcendent side.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people who are in a way over individuated in the West are seeking community, and people maybe in general terms, right, in the East are really seeking to escape that sense of suffocation by community, where you're not allowed to do anything that your family doesn't approve of, or etc. But
so one of the things which I've been playing with recently is to have I make up lots of words because I can't find words for what I mean, although sometimes I find that there are words that other people have found but I didn't know them. So I've started thinking, it feels to me like in that process of evolution we are individuating. We become that as psyches, as souls, as individuals, we're becoming more particular. And that when you said this is a process of waking up, that what we're going into, the next phase of that, is that having individuated, it becomes more possible to what I call unividuate, become an individual conscious of unity. And the sense of excitement I get, the reason I do this, the reason it's great to speak to you, especially, in all honesty, because you're younger than me, I love that, because it feels like, look, this is the wave that's coming up, and to take this forward, this process in which we're enabling ourselves to think for ourselves, to be ourselves, not part of the unconscious collective where we just go along with whatever we're born into. We can doubt that, we can individuate and become autonomous from it, and that gives us enough soul strength, as it were, the robustness to be able to become conscious of this fundamental oneness from which we are arising and to which we are reaching up as well. And that on my positive days, it feels like, I think we're in a process of unividuating onto it. That's the next step for us.
Yeah. Well, that's why conversations like this are so exciting, because I think, one of the things I learned as I got through my late teens and trying to discover enlightenment within, is that there's also a social dimension to waking up, and that finding communities of others who are also on a similar path is really important, and that there's a form of consciousness that can only emerge in conversation between people. So it's not just an individual thing. Maybe it's a unividual thing. I love this term that you've coined, because it allows us to both retain our sense of individual freedom, but also to exercise and express that freedom in a way that is amplified. Because there's a way in which I think of the I'm sure you're familiar with Burning Man.
I am.
Where
I've not been, but I've been invited constantly, but I've not made it.
I think you would appreciate the culture that emerges there for the way that it both celebrates the individual and celebrates community, and celebrates a certain form of community that is it's completely devoted to the elevation of the individual, but in a way that doesn't become like me, but that is more like there's a more loving sense of we all deserve to discover our own unique gift and our own unique way of expressing ourselves. And it's a whole form of like ritual spirituality oriented around fostering this type of awareness. And there's a shadow side, of course, too, but it just strikes me as a laboratory where the experimentation with this type of consciousness is occurring.
Yeah. So I think one of the shifts, and I hear it coming from various quarters now, is to stop thinking of awakening as an individual. It is individual, but it's also not individual. By its very nature, it's something we're doing together. And a lot of the practices I do with people are all about connection. I mean, I'm going to run a retreat at New Year, and it will be all about connection. It will all be about having such a profound connection with each other that it's just absolutely overwhelming. And what I see that happens with that is that, it's fun. I had a woman turn up today, actually, about something else completely. I was seeing my wife, Debbie. And I never talked to her, but she'd come to a big event I did in Glastonbury, where I live, where I just brought people in and had them profoundly connect with each other in a beautiful setting with lovely music for about an hour. And she just described how she'd been terrified. She just thought, oh God, I can't stay here, I've got to go. And then I thought, no, I'll stay. And then sat down with somebody and started gazing with them and thought, this is the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. But by the end said it was the best experience of her life, that she'd just been overwhelmed by what had happened. And so I have really come around to thinking, look, if the more we can foster these, it feels like we need two things. We need deep connection, which breaks us, so that unividuality, it transcends the individual. And we need meaning, because like you said, we have the experience, you wake up, it's like, wow. And then there's life. And those two are not, they're not different. They're the same process. Mm-hmm. And the life bit, it feels like that's where the philosophy is important, to have something which can genuinely have meaning and not just arbitrarily, but by actually addressing our experience as it is, with all of its ambiguity. And if we can feel like we can bring those two together, we can move this forward.
Yeah. It seems like the whole human beings are part of an evolutionary process that's more than just our individual species, right? It's really the whole planet.
Yeah.
At least, but if we shift the scale of what's evolving to the level of the planet, like we're one species in this ecosystem, and we've reached a phase of Earth evolution where human beings, to be most of service to the evolutionary process, can't just become renunciates and wander off into the desert or the forest to discover inner enlightenment. There's like literally almost no forest left. There's nowhere to go without society.
There's oh God, what a thought.
So we have to go deeper into this relational matrix and see in what ways that spirituality can be transformative. One of the shared experience. Yeah.
Sorry, Matt. Just because you said that, it feels like one of the things which I was thinking just last week. It felt like one of a phrase which kind of captures it for me is that reality is relationship. And this might have something, you might be able to tell me what Whitehead's saying about this, because it feels to me, I don't think this is all one. I think this is all one and two at the same time. Or it's one thing in relationship with itself, or it's one thing observing itself from every perspective, that it's the meeting of object and subject, oneness and manyness. It's formless and form.
Yeah.
All those things are coexisting, and therefore the very fabric of everything we're experiencing is relational.
Right.
And past and future, all of that.
Yeah. I mean, Whitehead has this beautiful phrase. He says, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures. So in some ways, he's a pluralist. He's not a monist. Everything is connected. And here, I think Whitehead is inheriting the American philosopher William James, who his last lecture series was published as a book called A Pluralistic Universe.
Yeah, I have it.
And James says, yes, everything is connected, but not everything is connected to everything else in the same way.
Yeah.
Everything's connected in a sort of strung along way. So it could be, to get from this thing to that thing, you can't just go, straight from one to the other. You have to go through a series of other connections or nodes, right? So there's a web-like nature to reality. Everything is interrelated, but it's interrelated in, to have things in relationship, they can't just be one. They have to somehow have some independence. And so, Whitehead's whole ontology, I think the reason it's difficult to understand is not only because of the processual dimension of it. We're so used to thinking of things that just are what they are, and that identity persists through time unproblematically. It's hard enough to think in process terms, but the relationality of Whitehead's ontology is also counterintuitive, at least for our materialistic common sense,
So
because
I have a,
Whitehead is,
go
yeah,
on,
I mean,
please go
he's
on.
really saying that we exist inside of each other, and that literally your past experience, the perished or expired moments of your experience are radiated to me. I receive them. They become part of my present moment of experience. So I'm literally inheriting your past. It becomes what I am, and this happens in a reciprocal way.
I
So
don't
that
get that. I don't get that. Say that again. What is that? I'd like to understand
um,
what that means.
it's how Whitehead thinks of causality, causal relationship. And for him, energy and emotion are like the same thing. So physical energy is the transmission of emotion in Whitehead's universe, right? He's a panpsychist. And so when he thinks of how perceiving beings like you and I relate to each other, in each moment, you're having an experience, it arises and perishes. And when it arises, it's subjective and immediate for you. When it perishes, it gets radiated out to me. And then in my next moment of subjective immediacy, I'm receiving your past experience. And it's like the material out of which I realize my own new subjective moment of
You mean
experience.
if I share that with you, or anyway?
If you talk, obviously, if we're in a conversation, but
Yeah.
in the more physical way, the energy that we're made out of is vibrating, and it's radiating out. You're radiating to me, and I'm radiating to you, and we absorb one another. And what I become in each moment is in part what you were in the past, and what the whole past environment was.
Yeah. I think this is very similar. So I have a funny thing with, I'm a kind of, I'm I don't know what I am really, but I don't. I'm just a strange, curious guy who's lived this oddball life. But so my way, I can't, when I'm really working, which is all the time right now, I can't read too much. I have to work in a different way. I have to really just follow what's coming. It's like things are being, I'm listening to something and questioning and listening. And then afterwards, I kind of go back and find, like, oh, hang on, this is similar to, but I tend to get the information from the inside rather than from the outside, and then find it on the outside later. So Whitehead was one of these, and I knew about Whitehead, obviously, and he'd been around forever. I've tried reading him, found him difficult, but realized as I was writing Soul Story that there seemed to be, but partly because of the process philosophy, because of the foundation of my philosophy in Soul Story is that that time is reality, that there's a time stream, and that felt very, very, very similar to Whitehead. So I looked him up and basically I just sat and looked at his picture for a long time and fell in love with him, and felt like, oh, you're family. You're part of this same thing, aren't you? How nice. And so I have a strange kind of emotional connection with him because of that.
Yeah.
So you've got the time things are similar. So the way I would try and say, I think what you've just said for Whitehead would be, for me, time is, nothing's perishing. It's like it's gone, but it's still there. Everything's accumulating, and then this is riding on the moment, is riding on the coexistence of the past and the possible. This ever expanding, the wisdom of the universe, the matrix of information, which is moving us onto something new. But that has reached this level of psyche, and by psyche again, I have a different take on panpsychism, because I don't want to use the word psyche for atoms, but they do say, I do think, I agree with him. I think they have subjectivity, and
Sure.
that there's I think, would you say, I'm going to say a few things and then you tell me whether they're similar or different. So I've been thinking recently that is what Whitehead means by an occasion, is that similar to what I'm exploring when I go, look, there is no objective world and subjective world. There's the meeting of subject and object on every level. And that what exists is always that. It's always the objective information subjectively perceived, always.
Yeah.
And that's that movement. And then we've reached this level of doing it on what I call psyche or soul, this non-material level of meaning, of transmaterial, really. It's gone beyond materiality, and we're in it right now. And on that level, I think we're connected objectively, just like we are on this level. So absolutely, that we're sharing information with each other as much on that level as we are on this level. And in that way, it does feel like, yeah, the information which has arisen here is going to be shared with everyone, actually, because it's a communal space. It's another ecology. It's just an ecology of soul, like this is an ecology of life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's definitely a very Whiteheadian vision. I mean, when he describes experience, he says it's perpetually perishing. He's actually getting that term from John Locke. But in Whitehead's metaphysical scheme, to say that experience is perpetually perishing doesn't mean it doesn't last, or that it's not still present in some way. His vision of reality is this perpetual oscillation between subjective immediacy and objective immortality. He likes to invent new terms and new phrases too.
I know, it's kind of funny. I just feel like, yeah, okay, we suffer from the same problem here.
Yes. So what concrescence is, it's like Whitehead's most important new term. It's the growing together of the already actualized past with the not yet actualized future, or the potential future, into a novel moment of self-enjoyment, is a phrase he uses, or of experience.
So the immortality of the past is because it's fixed. It's done. It's there forever.
Right.
Oh, this
it's
is
kind of, it's like a fossil.
Yeah, this is exactly the same.
Mm.
And I would see that. I mean, the metaphor I think that vision of the past is quite similar to Rupert Sheldrake's, or the Charles Peirce and people like that. But I think
it is. It's funny. I was just emailing with Rupert this morning because he's writing about Whitehead, and he's like, does this sound like something Whitehead would agree with? And he's like, yes, it does. So Rupert's been studying Whitehead, for years. So there's definitely similarity there.
And so does Whitehead? So for me, the image that I use more and more now, because I think in terms of the word information, I think is a good term for us now for obvious reasons. Dangerous also, but also useful. It just feels like, using that metaphor, it feels like what's happening is that through the process, through time, the accumulation of time, that information is forming. There's the Rupert and Charles and all those, the habits of nature. But actually, I'm thinking like algorithms of nature, or if you want a more spiritual term, the wisdom of nature. It's like it's building, it's learning. And it's learning how to do this, then it's learning how to do this, and look, it knows how to do this now. And that there's a continual movement, and everything, now I will be different, and I will have learned a whole new things from this conversation. And that is the way that there is a tendency towards greater and greater emergence of novelty, to take Whitehead's lovely line. And that's almost inevitable in the process. Is that right? Do you think, for him?
Oh yeah. I mean, he even uses this phrase that you like so much, the idea of the time as cumulative, or the accumulation of time. I mean, that's
he uses that
reality. Oh yeah. Great minds think alike.
How wonderful. No, I'm just following his in his slipstream. I'm just coming up behind in his slipstream. He's made it easy for me. How wonderful. That's what. Now tell me this. This is just a kind of a little bit of, I just wonder, read it and I thought, is that true? I read that he invented the word creativity.
Yeah, I've read that too, and I haven't myself gone and I guess nowadays with Google, you can search all the books published for the last few hundred years and see if when that word was first used. But he was at least the first one to use it in a way that applied it beyond just human beings, to refer to the non-human world as creative, and to say that creativity is a principle beyond just, thinking about what artists have or something. That is definitely new. Whether he invented the, taking creation and turning it into creativity, I'm not sure. I'm happy to believe it, but I don't usually say that because I don't have the evidence to back that up. But
So are you okay for us to keep exploring Whitehead for a bit? Is that okay with you?
sure, I'm not bored with him yet.
Yeah, it's just a real delight to be able to speak to you, but also to speak to someone with this who's engaged with this in a way that I haven't, because I'm also aware that he has a theology as well,
Oh, yeah.
and obviously so do I. So one of the things for me has been, okay, look, this is the ground that it's coming from. I don't really see any more a beginning, to be honest with you. I see a constant process of becoming, but that what's becoming, if I go right to the depth of it now, there is something that everything has in common. There's one thing, and that's being. Even the empty space exists. It's like it has no qualities. There's a formless being which is becoming everything.
Yeah.
And so that the ground for me is, the big shift for me over the last few years has been stopping using the conventional spiritual thing of, the ground is consciousness or anything like that, or a divinity. It's like, no, the ground is something which exists, and it isness, if you like, use the Zen term. It's that is becoming everything. It's the potentiality for everything, and that's a kind of Brian Swim actually, was the first person I came across who talked about, where does the universe come from? Well, the potentiality for the universe, and
Yeah.
and there was something about that well, that's good. So the ground for me is that kind of, what is the simplest thing I can imagine, something which is but has no qualities other than existence, in this process of emergent process of becoming more and more and more, and heading towards the whole thing conscious of itself, which
Yeah.
is God by any other name. And so the universe is flowering into God rather than coming from it, because it's becoming the most emergent thing. It's not coming from the most emergent thing, it's becoming the most emergent thing. How does that sit with yourself first, and then also with Whitehead? Or either way, do it whichever way you want.
Yeah. Well, certainly my I, there's a tradition in theology that in I think it's not just in Western and Judeo-Christian theology, but really it's pretty much, it seems global, of this notion that the divine creates out of nothing, that the divine is all powerful and creates out of nothing this physical universe. It's more prominent certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but there are versions of it in many traditions, I'll say. And that always struck me as problematic because, there's the problem of evil, right? If there's an all-powerful, all-good God who creates a world that has evil in it, then it seems like there must have been a flaw in God to begin with, because what gives, right? But what Whitehead does with his process theology is imagine a God that, as he puts it, suffers with creation.
Yeah.
And Whitehead's God he describes God as a creature of creativity. So it's pretty heterodox, if not downright heretical, to describe God as a creature. At least, Whitehead's coming out of an Anglican family. His father and grandfather were both Anglican ministers and educators. So he's calling God a creature, and saying that creativity is really, really the ultimate. And his God also is polar. His God has these two phases, just like our experience for Whitehead is sort of phasic. God is phasic. There's what he calls the primordial nature of God, which sounds a lot like what you mean by being, but it might be different. So maybe I'll describe what Whitehead means by his primordial pole of God, and he has the consequent pole, which sounds a lot like this emergent God that you're speaking to. But for Whitehead, the primordial nature of God is God as the first creature of creativity that sort of gives some character to infinite potential. Infinite potential on its own is, you could say, it's akin to just chaos. There's nothing definite happening. It's just infinite possibility, right? So God's primordial nature gives some definite character to possibility.
So is there two things there? There's possibility and God?
God is an actual entity for Whitehead. So
there's possibility and there's God, and they're two different things for him?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Creativity is pure possibility. It's one way of saying it, and that God is the initial. It's what's first realized by that infinite possibility. So God is a precipitate of pure possibility.
So God is the first possibility.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. And that first possibility then it's almost like the theologian Catherine Keller calls it a cosmic genetic code or something. And it sort of just sets a template that is repeated throughout the rest of the history of creation in each of us. So each being then contains this initial, Whitehead calls it the initial eros, like the Greek term for like desire. It's this initial sense of something, the desire for something definite out of pure possibility.
Okay, so that's quite similar to what Ken Wilber was saying to me when I sat down with him. I think probably he got that from Whitehead. I would have thought so. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, carry on. I want to push that a little bit, but
so that's the initial eros. That's the primordial pole of God, and then there's the consequent pole, or what Whitehead calls the final beauty. And
this man.
So God's primordial pole, Whitehead says, is unconscious. It's God existing by God's self, separate from the world. God's consequent pole, though, is God with the world, is God experiencing everything that happens in the whole history of the universe, and somehow finding a way to make it consistent with that initial sense of what the best possibility is. Now, evil, then, what we perceive as evil, is a function of the fact that God is as subject to creativity as the rest of us, and that each creature has its own connection.
Say that line one more time, Matt.
God is as subject to creativity as the rest of us.
Subject to creativity. Okay. What does that mean?
Which is to say that God's initial sense of the best possibility wasn't. Creativity continues on. And
okay, so God's first idea weren't his best, like the rest of us.
Yeah, it needed work, and God's consequent nature, after responding to all the free decisions of the creatures of the world, becomes conscious. The primordial pole was not conscious. The consequent pole becomes conscious because it's responsive to the freedom of something other than itself, and coming into relationship with something other than itself, which is, if God is, Whitehead says, trying to hold the worlds together and save the world as a poet tries to save their experience, to save it in the sense of elevate it to a level of aesthetic harmony that maybe without the poet's expressive and without the poet's longing, it wouldn't be harmonious. But the poet is able to give some interpretation to what occurs such that it lifts its beauty to the surface. And so God is constantly trying to, it's one God. It seems like there's two gods here, but it's one God for Whitehead. That's the difficult part of his theology. And
no, I can completely get that. So can I clarify some things, or what you're describing is uncannily similar to stuff that I was writing about 20 years ago, or almost 20 years ago, where I was following much more of a I wasn't using the word God then. I'd done that lots in my past. I almost became a friar, and so God was close to me, but I'd abandoned that as a word because of all the problems with it. Taken on the Eastern translation and the idea of consciousness as this thing, which doesn't work for me at the moment, and put that at the beginning, but had this problem, which was, but it's unconscious. So I write about unconscious consciousness, or I have this image of like, oh, well, imagine something where there's just light, it would be dark because there's nothing for the light to reflect on. And that way it's a kind of, so it's something, and that sounds very similar. So the archetypal journey that's been around for me for quite a few decades now, which sounds very similar, is that the journey is from an unconscious oneness through a increasingly conscious individuality to conscious oneness. And the conscious oneness is that primal conscious of itself, but through the individuality. So it's a both and state. It's both individual and one. Is that kind of the thing he's playing with, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to say that God is subject to creativity is to say that there's this principle of unrest. Creativity is a principle of unrest, and not even God can rest. So God thought that it had created like the best possible world, but creativity keeps rushing on. And so God's now having to respond to, again and again, the new decisions that creativity makes to manifest possibility into actuality.
So, all right. So now kind of leave, because Alfred's not here or he might show up, but to represent himself. But just with you, Matt. So the problem I've had with my own view from the past has been to say increasingly, look, why am I calling this God? Or what is it? What quality? It's not conscious. What is it? It seems like it's not anything. And in a way, I mean, in Soul Story, I use Hegel's term. I call it spirit, and I go from primal spirit to a transcendent spirit. Now, I don't know what word you use. At the moment, I like being, just because it feels like, that's the one quality that everything has. The one thing I feel like I don't feel comfortable with, and I felt this when I talked to Ken, is this idea of the eros. Where does that come from? What is that? This kind of, it's like there's the kind of, it's the involution idea. It's like the falling down to rise up, and it feels like, do we need that, or actually have we just got a process of forever rising up? That we've got a process where there is no beginning. There's the beginning for our universe, but everything is coming from the past. Everything's coming from what's already been formed and repeating it in a new way. And that I mean, it's impossible to question beginnings or not, but just like, forget that. But just rather one thing, which is being in a constant process of becoming, in which it reaches up to the more emergent, and within a universe like ours, or here at least, what it's doing is it's reaching up to something in which it's conscious of itself, which it wasn't. And that you could, and when you do that, once you've got God as the thing which is arising and conscious of itself, then you can say, well, the whole thing's God. It's always been God. It's a bit like, you were an egg and a sperm, but now it's you. We can say, well, you were the egg and the sperm too. It's all been you the whole time. It's just, there was no, when the egg and sperm, there was no intentionality. It was completely different, but it was heading to you. And now it's arrived at you. You can go, oh, that's, that whole journey, that whole process of time is what you are, or what your body is anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's so tempting to think of the history of the universe as a timeline, and like there's a beginning at some definite moment in the past, and it's heading off in some definite direction into the future. And I think it's somehow we're being asked by a spirit or whatever to consider two diametrically opposed, or what appear at first to be diametrically opposed perspectives, which is this temporal one of a history that's finite with a definite beginning, and perhaps a definite ending, and then this other axis of reality that's the eternal rather than the temporal, where, I mean, to even talk about a beginning of time, you realize doesn't make sense, because what came before that? And
It's what came before time. Ooh.
so there's a way that eternity intersects with time, um, all the time, right? So
Yeah.
eternity is always participating, and I mean, that's the now. And there's a way in which, you know, for Whitehead, it's not like the primordial nature of God is in the past. It's
No,
not. No, present,
this is
right?
the same. That's when I say, look, being's here right now. And because it
Right.
has no form, it doesn't change. And
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't change, it's timeless. It's timeless and formless, and it's right here. And what's interesting to me from what's got me into all of this, which sounds similar to you, it's been experience. It's just happened to me the other week in the most dramatic way I've ever had. Is that when my attention goes right into that, this formless, I'm formless. It's like the thing
Yeah.
which is experiencing this, my being is that formless being from which is the foundation now for everything that's arising. So, and that is non-temporal. It's just not. But it has no
Yeah.
qualities. It feels like, or rather, in itself it doesn't. But then when I reach up to it, it feels like it is what transcends and includes all qualities. It is
Mm-hmm.
it's the one thing which includes everything. And in that way, that sounds like what Whitehead is saying, is
Yeah.
that's what I'm by God. That's what I mean by God now. I mean, when I touch that thing of which I am a part, and which
Right.
everything is a aspect.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
does feel utterly benign and totally beautiful,
Mm.
and well, love.
Yeah. Whitehead says, in Process and Reality, that the chief danger in philosophy is narrowness in the selection of evidence. And it's
Yeah,
precisely because, for understandable reasons, philosophers, they love words, they love explanations. They thought that what they were looking for was some sort of a sentence or collection of sentences that would explain the universe or reality. And Whitehead, rather than saying that or thinking that the abstract could ever explain the concrete, he says it's precisely the reverse. It's our concrete experience that could be only our concrete experience could be the explanation that we're really seeking. We're seeking the elucidation of experience. We're not seeking some formula representative of experience or that would describe experience. We'd never be satisfied with that. That's not what we really want.
so
So
did he have the idea in that, Matt, of what uh I when I've written about it many years ago, of a gnosis? Did he have that? Because when I've said similar things to that, the point I've been making was that, what the big revelation to me when I was a kid, when I had my first big awakening, was this is the answer, and it's not words. And that's fundamental to me. That's the foundation, and the words are like a map to try and describe everything. But the thing in which I understand is just a sublime being, what I call
yeah,
deep awake. Did he have that? Do you think? Did he experience that? Does he talk about that?
yeah, um, he does. I mean, he's a mystic who also happened to be a rather um, amazing mathematician
And yeah, I mean,
and
the work he
logician.
did on logic, and just
Yeah,
amazing.
because
What a man.
I'm sure you share this sort of temptation. It's like knowing that there is some ineffable mystery that I mean, it's not that hard to contact, right?
No,
Assuming it's just like you're just there when you direct your attention toward it. But then how do you point at it? And it's like there's at least for me, maybe it's I'm an especially mercurial person. I want to communicate about it. I want to
yeah,
point at it. I want to share it with people. And so the temptation is to immediately go into language, and it's really an enjoyable process. It can also be frustrating when there's misunderstanding, because the words are just the fingers pointing at the moon. And but I mean, it's an inescapable temptation.
and that's why for me, where I've ended up, and it's and I'm very very grateful because it suits me, is that he's got these two definite sides to what I do. there's a philosophical side, and then more importantly, there's an experiential side, which has been getting people together and going, okay, I'm going to talk about something, and then we're actually going to experience it.
Mm-hmm.
And what has really shocked me over the last 20 years is it pretty much people do. And then you just look at their face, and there's completely different. You know, when you actually go, oh yeah, there's this huge love. The whole universe is permeated by love. How did I miss that?
Yeah.
Then there is a knowing. Something changes. You just got it in that moment. You may lose it, and certainly you will, but
Yeah.
you've had it. And
Yeah.
there's a new reference point then, isn't there?
Yeah. And I think it's so important to do that type of work, because at this moment in the history of our species, you know, we've moved through, you call it the soul crisis. We're in the soul crisis.
Yeah.
And it's both because of modern science, but it's also because of the disorienting implications of evolution.
Yeah.
It's also because of the way that the universe has become disenchanted, and the way that we've shifted into a more commodified, you know, understanding of what our values are. I mean, we're living under late capitalism. All of the social pressure is pushing us to become more individual, but in a commodified kind of way, and that
Yeah.
isolates us from one another. And we're at this crusting wave, right? And it's looking for a shore to crash on. And I think these types of encounters that people can have, facilitated by people like you, coming into a new kind of awareness of how, yeah, individuality is so important, so crucial. But like, rip the packaging off of this commodified form of individuality and discover, you know, what you're calling unividuality. Discover a sense of value that's deeper than what the capitalist worldview suggests that it is. Value that's deeper even than just anything merely human, in the narrow sense of only being about our species. Because again, like, we are an organ of the earth. Our consciousness is an expression of a billion-year process of evolution. And who and what we are as humans is not at all separate from the oceans and from the forests. And I think relationship is not just something we need to discover with other human beings, right?
I think that's so important. I really like the idea, by the way, that we're in the late capitalism. That sounds so optimistic. Yeah, this is the late phase. You wait, it's almost over. I do hope so. And I really, because what I'm suggesting with the emergent picture, because I want to rescue, having kind of tried to rescue the kind of non-dual thing and put it back into context with the evolutionary. I also want to look at the other key elements in the esoteric traditions: the immortality of the soul, the dreamlike nature of existence, all those sort of things, and go, look, I think that itself has evolved, and that this level of psyche has evolved as its own domain and exists now independently. But often I think people misunderstand me when I say that, because it plays into, often, don't you find this with ideas, that people latch onto something and then make it part of something they already know? And
Yeah.
you know, and it falls into that kind of dualism of, you know, that's, now we've reached something. And it's not like that at all for me, because it's all one time stream. It will forever be linked to the earth, because it's come through the earth and returns to it. The whole thing is all one thing, and right up towards, you know, transcendent divinity is all one thing. And so that unividuality, what seems really on our agenda, is how the hell do we, it's like we're looking back at our own past in a way, when we're looking at the natural world from which we've arisen. It's also present, of course, but, and how we have a relationship with it. And then in ourselves, where we wrestle in our souls and as cultures, with the fact that we've got everything we've been in us, and we've been some pretty dark things.
Yeah.
And they're all still there, and we have to come to an accommodation with them, and transform them and move them on and find new ways to relate. And it's a hell of a task, but it's a beautiful one.
Yeah, it's all one stream. And, you know, it's like, part of our challenge, I think, is um, reigniting a sense of genuine spiritual longing in people. Even just that's a possibility. I think people's apertures have so narrowed, and our sense of possibility has been so foreclosed that we don't even think that we just given up on meaning.
Okay, so so what you've just said there,
mm-hmm.
that feels really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
As philosophers, speaking now as two people who've ended up calling themselves philosophers, lovers of wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
of all the things we could be,
mm-hmm.
because what seems to what it feels like in the intellectual mainstream, not in most of society actually, but in the intellectual mainstream, which does have a huge effect, it's become impossible to think certain thoughts. And a lot of those thoughts are necessary if you want to spiritually awaken. And that what we therefore need is a new, intellectually credible story, which can account for the things we found in science and blah, 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 and also harmonize it with the reality of what spirituality has been talking about. And if we could, if it's intellectually robust enough, then it can come into the mainstream. And when I did my TED talk, I thought, damn it, I'm just going to say this because I want it to be true, which was, I think there is something coming, and there will be another shift, and this will be a big part of the shift when it comes, which is a way, just like that shift that happens with science, where it's suddenly we were in a new world, that a shift which enables us to keep all of that and then go, oh, and this is real. And not only is it real, but it's really the leading edge of what is real. And we should be paying so much attention to it, because it's where all of the meaning of life is. It's who we are. Mm-hmm. That's what so people can think these thoughts, because at the moment they can't. A lot of people don't go here because they just think only an idiot would do that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really, I really agree with you that there's this dimension of, like, we need a worldview transformation, and that there's theoretical and philosophical and intellectual work to be done to come up with a credible story. I also think there's a very much more practical side to this, that's rooted in like political economy, but also in ritual, and in particular grief ritual. Like the accumulation of the past, right, is such that, and I think it's unique for each people at different around the planet. Like the United States of America has its own unique social history and traumas that are not in the time stream that we're inheriting as a people, that we can't spiritually awaken until we've, as a collective, looked at those knots, untangled them, and had, we could think of it in terms of like restorative justice, or the ancient Israelites used to have lament rituals where they would collectively, like in a cathartic way, and the Greeks had this with their tragedians, where there's a release or a catharsis or a processing of this knotted energy from the past. And I feel like human beings have reached a place now where we can very clearly see, I think, the ideal that we would like to achieve as a species. I mean, even the idea of a human is pretty new. Like the idea that we're more than just the nation or the tribe, or the locality that we emerge from. It's a pretty new idea. Maybe it started in the axial age, but it's really come onto the scene that most people have a sense for, oh yeah, wouldn't it be great if we could all just be human together? But we're not ready for that yet, because of all this unprocessed grief and trauma and injustice that hasn't been looked at, honestly. So I feel like that's part of the journey of spiritual awakening too, right?
I think you put that. I think that's the clearest I've heard that said. I think you really did a great job of. I could really, really see it. I mean, obviously, I've been around it for a while, but what you just said just captured it, and makes perfect sense. I think makes perfect sense that that's the process we're in. Well, yeah. It's all of it. It's like that. But that's a huge part of it. Just massive.
Yeah.
I love that. What was it you said about grief? Grief rituals, did you say? You said
Grief rituals.
you
Yeah.
used the word grief. It really came to life when you used that word. The
Yeah.
understanding of it just opened up for me. It was a
Well,
beautiful moment.
yeah, one of my teachers at CIS, actually, I was a student here first,
Okay.
Stanislav Grof,
Oh, right.
psychedelic psychotherapist,
Yeah.
psychiatrist. He used to say, and still does say, that the full experience of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. And so when I say grief ritual, I'm thinking of giving
I don't know
people
what
an
that
opportunity.
means. What Stanislav was
So,
saying.
in other words, he would talk about the way that trauma gets lodged in our bodies physically, but physiologically, but also in our emotional body. Traumas are like stuck energy, right? And that we might think, oh, if we want to move on from that, we should just leave it alone. But he invites people, whether it's through breath work or through psychedelic journeying, to go into those traumatic emotions and those wounds, because the full experience of those wounds, just fully dropping into them without fear of being destroyed, burns them off in a way. So the full experience of an emotion is the funeral pyre.
Okay.
In other words, it
Okay.
lifts it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that's very similar to what I'm exploring with the idea of passivity, that the past has a weight to it, which is a
Yeah,
good thing because it keeps everything the same, but it's a
yeah,
bad thing because it keeps everything the same. And that and that we, you know, that there's that there's repetition and creativity playing it out, and that the what is formed will repeat itself, and
right,
that we all suffer from that. We suffer from that collectively, and that things in the past which have done that will repeat, or they will play themselves out. That's the algorithm now, and that to
yeah,
use that rather less attractive metaphor, I like the burning one, but you know,
yeah,
using
yeah, yeah,
you know, you have to go back and reprogram it. You know, it's like
yeah.
you have to, you
Mm-hmm.
know, sort it out, transmute it. Let's use the alchemy one. It's
Mm-hmm.
rather nice. We have to take the lead and turn it into gold.
Yeah. I just feel like, we need to do some triage looking at our collective situation right now. We're in the emergency room, and what's unfolding, like at the level of politics and political economy, is, if it continues on its current path, will make it very difficult for the awakening of individuals, I think. And so it's like, how do we triage and say, okay, what do we need to attend to immediately so as to protect the conditions that make spiritual awakening possible? Not that these are separate endeavors,
No, I
but
absolutely hear what you're saying there.
I just feel like, earlier you were speaking to the way that the intelligentsia and the experts in our society, right, are kind of closed off to some of the key ideas that would allow us to escape this disenchanted nightmare. But the average person is maybe more emotionally and intellectually open because
Yep.
they don't have set ideas that they've had trained into them at
Yep.
Harvard or Yale or whatever, or Oxford or Cambridge, but they're less sensitive to, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like spiritual awakening and the journey of enlightenment is less available because they're just worried about paying the rent and finding a new job, or they're having chest pain and they're worried about the emergency room bill if they were to go to the hospital for it. And I think a lot of people um, they don't have the material conditions that make spiritual awakening possible. And so
So
I think, yeah,
when I was much younger, this is just a little silly anecdote from my life, just because it made me think of it. But when I was much younger, 20, I had a foray into Marxism, and the reason that the way I worked it together with my mysticism was it just felt like, yeah, what we need to do is create a society in which people can awaken, and that has to be a society which is social and communal, and which can allow the conditions, because you're absolutely right. It's much easier, it seems. Having said that, you know, and maybe this is why it's easier now, because what strikes me about the culture we live in is that, God knows there's a lot of stresses on people and everyone thinks it's all terrible. In some respects it is, but in other respects it's the best it's ever been by a long way for human beings. I mean, we live in the most incredible conditions compared to those of our forebears that struggled long and hard to get us here, and we're enjoying the fruits of their creativity and their labor.
Yeah.
So you'd think there is a certain and one would have to say that, although religion's in decline, I think genuine spirituality is on the ascent, wouldn't you say, even if it's just in a small way?
Well, there's certainly more people pursuing it than ever before. I mean, just in terms of real numbers. And I do agree that it's so double-sided, right, and paradoxical that the average middle-class person, even if the middle class is shrinking now, is living a life with the conveniences that only kings and queens would have enjoyed a few centuries ago, right?
So, not even kings and queens, yeah.
Right.
They couldn't do this.
Yeah, they didn't have refrigerators and television sets and stuff, or the internet that allows us to talk
exactly
on the other side of the world. So I certainly don't want to overlook that. But there's another sense in which, right, it's as though since the Industrial Revolution, or maybe just the information revolution with all these new technologies, there's a certain form of short-sightedness to it. It's almost as though we've created this fancy spaceship and loaded it up with fuel and blasted off into space, and given no concern to the blast radius, what was being burnt to a crisp as we took off, and no thought to how we might run out of fuel, and then
I think that's exactly what we've done. And I think it's not because we just didn't give it any thought; it's because it never occurred to us, and that's the whole problem, isn't it? The whole problem is that every time we do something new, it has consequences we never imagined.
Yeah,
and then we have to deal with the consequences we never imagined.
And I think Brian Swim has a way of thinking about this moment. And he's inheriting like Thomas Berry's work, and Thomas Berry and Brian are both inheriting Teilhard de Chardin's work, the Jesuit paleontologist. And there's this notion of the whole Earth going through a phase transition as the noosphere emerges, right? And it's not just a spiritual transformation. Like the very materiality of the Earth is being totally remade by the presence of human beings right now. And so whatever's happening, there's a way of looking at that as, wow, what a loss. Like, was mass extinction really necessary for human beings to bring forth a noosphere? Well, maybe it was. And maybe the form of creativity and consciousness that will inherit the Earth will be so beautiful and wonderful that it will see how it was necessary and worth it. There have been mass extinctions before too, so it's not like this is the first time the Earth has gone through a convulsion like this. But yeah, I mean, what a time to be alive. There's so much happening all at once, and we're all desperately searching for the pattern that will explain it.
My own hunch is what you said earlier, that kind of looking back, that actually that there's the hope that we don't have to completely trash something for this beautiful thing to arrive, but that actually the arriving of the beautiful thing will make us see that we don't want to trash where it's come from, that there's a kind of a feedback from that of wisdom, and that we're on the cusp of that taking hold, because that would be a marvelous thing. Having said that, right now we've just gone in the opposite direction where we are, and one must. There we are.
Oh, in the UK, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Pardon?
Well, you mean we've just gone in the opposite direction? Do you mean in the UK, or
in the UK?
Oh,
yeah. We're basically we in the UK. We just follow on slightly behind America at the moment. That's our little thing that's been going.
Well,
on.
I hope that's true, and that this isn't a premonition. What the UK elections aren't a premonition for what happens in the United States.
Well, that's a two-way
as Brexit
thing.
was for Trump. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true too, isn't it? Oh God. Well, there's definitely an interfertilization that happens.
Yeah. But that's a whole nother
But
conversation.
it is another conversation, and it's really the same thing, isn't it? It's that sense in which, just as for individuals, you know, I can have them. I had the most sublime experience of my life 3 or 4 weeks ago, and that affected me and has always been with me. But the other, you know, 3 or 4 days ago, I thought, oh, I've completely lost that.
Yeah.
And now I found it again a bit more, and I'm in relationship with it. And it's like that is collectively, isn't it, as well? These things rise up, we think they're done, and then they come back and we go
Yeah.
through them. And that's what
Well, there's a lesson in here in the political situation in the UK, and it's the same thing all over the world, I think, that in this rush to realize this universal ideal of humanity, um, which has been driven largely by globalization and the forces of the capitalist market. In that rush, we've, I think, gone too fast and belittled and neglected the sense in which human beings need roots, and they need, you know, we are beings who are born into a familial matrix, a cultural matrix, and, you know, the nation is certainly a modern construct. It's not that old, and but there's a sense of that people get meaning from being rooted in lineage, right? And it's very easy for more cosmopolitan people to just shame them for being racist or something. And I'm not saying there's not some of that going on, but it's, you know, racism and populism, nationalism, they're resurgent. Nativism, they're resurgent because we were rushing too quickly for globalization and neglecting the sense in which, wait a minute, we have this whole past to inherit, and we have to do it with more reverence, I think, than the commodification of culture and this rush to a universal humanity was allowing. So
that's
I'm not sure how we.
that's an incredibly wise thing to say, Matt. I think that's really and really helpful to me in the UK right now, because I think you're entirely right. So that we must stop, and I can't tell you what a delight it's been to meet you and to talk with you, and I'm so pleased that you initiated this to happen and that we're now connected, and yeah, I hope we can nurture that connection.
Oh yeah, likewise, Tim. It's been great to talk to you, and I look forward to more. And keep up the good work.
Yeah,
And
likewise.
I've only skimmed a couple of your more recent books, and I really love the style and the poetry of it, and I look forward to getting more into that. Because, you know, I'm such in the mindset of a scholar now, and I'm always reading as I'm writing and citing this and like situating. And the way that you're pursuing the expression of wisdom is so refreshing and liberating in a way. And so I'm gonna explore your writing more deeply and try to cultivate that in myself as well. So yeah, it's been great to talk.
So the line which is coming in my head, you'll probably know the right version of it, but I think it permeated our whole discussion. Is, I think, in one of my books, Mystery Experience, I think it was, I quoted Whitehead, where he said something like, philosophy starts and ends in wonder.
Philosophy begins in wonder, and at the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt.
Have a great night.
And you have a good day.
Take care.